고생들 많이 하셨습니다. 이제 마지막 세션입니다. 저희들 그저 동아시아 재단에서 이게 조직한 세션인데요. 저희들이 11개의 세션을 조직을 했습니다. 그래서 11개 세션 중에서 마지막 세션이 이 세션인데요. 아주 영어로 한국 분이 더 많으신데 뭐. East Asia Foundation organized 11 sessions at this Jejuporum. Out of 11, 6 were out of APLN, and 5 were just out of the East Asia Foundation, because East Asia Foundation was a co-convener of Jejuporum. Therefore, we have a stake in Jejuporum, and also we have contributed quite significant amount of money to the Jejuporum too. And I just met the Governor Won just a few minutes ago, and he really thanked East Asia Foundation for its contribution to the success of Jejuporum. Anyhow, this session will be talking about strategic diplomacy. I do not know what is meant by strategic diplomacy. Even I don't know about what is meant by public diplomacy, because previous session, Professor Kim Tae-hwan, that was the panel called the Middle Power and Public Diplomacy, and I raised a question on both middle power and public diplomacy. But I think it went very well. But today, in fact, Yo-Chen will be talking about the concept of middle power, and then, strategic diplomacy. Strategic diplomacy, and then Evelyn will be talking about strategic diplomacy vis-a-vis U.S.-China rivalry, and etc. And then South Korean case and the Chinese case. And Yo-Chen and Evelyn, they are from Australia National University. Then also they are husband and wife too. Let us make it public, okay? And Charlie Park is a professor of Seoul National University. He's the director for the Contemporary Japanese Studies at the Seoul National University. He's a quite famous columnist to Joseonilbo, the most conservative daily newspaper in South Korea. But he's not conservative, but apparently he's getting a lot of honorarium from Joseonilbo, and that is why he has been writing it. And then Hwang Jing, Hwang Jing is somewhat unfamiliar to Korean audience, but he's very well familiar with American audience, Chinese audience, and Southeast Asian audience. He got his PhD from Harvard, and he was a senior fellow at Brookings Institution quite some time. But then he turned it down. He came to Beijing and then moved to Singapore. Now he's a distinguished professor, endowed chair professor at the National University of Singapore. Okay, with a brief introduction, I will invite each of you give 3 to 4 minutes on your topic, and then we'll have about 20 minutes in the discussion among ourselves. Then I will open to the floor about 30 minutes. Okay, that's fair, right? And we want a participatory session rather than dictatorial session. Okay, voila, your turn.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I fear already that we will have a conclusion that the concept of strategic diplomacy does not have any strategic or analytical traction, and we should basically put it together with middle power diplomacy and have a big rethink, perhaps. Well, but I will try hard to, perhaps get to a different conclusion. And let me recap what we have discussed so far, particularly in the previous session. We talked about the return of geopolitics. We talked about potential multipolarity. We talked about network politics. We talked about deterrorization. We talked about middle power diplomacy. But we did not talk so much about something that happens in parallel, which is power diffusion. The ability to achieve outcomes by states is not becoming greater. It becomes much more difficult in today's globalized world to achieve outcomes. And that's the starting point of strategic diplomacy. We talk about we live in a very complex world. Well, marriage can be very complex too. Or
your
is
marriage
it,
complex?
we talk about complexity in so many different settings without actually addressing what complexity means. Complexity is very different from things being complicated. If things are being complicated, let's say the International Space Station, you can talk about the space lab, the engines, you can call NASA if you don't understand, you get a manual. You will then perhaps understand after studying the manual how the thing actually works. If you are confronted with a complex problem, then you do not have a manual. There is no preconceived way of action how to achieve a solution to a complex problem. Global finance. Why is it that a seemingly small event like the collapse of Lehman Brothers caused the collapse of the global financial system as a whole? How can you as a state basically then take control over those events? How can you achieve a solution of something that is beyond your control? So what strategic diplomacy advocates for and tries to look at is to look less at the issues. Yes, you can look at the issues as well, but within a system. It's basically diplomacy from a systems perspective. You need to look at the picture as a whole in order to address a problem effectively. And that then leads you to 3 analytical hooks. If you understand, if you take a systemic approach to a problem, then you would think in terms of what is the best entry point to address a problem. You would need to think about tipping points that actually drives the dynamics of a system. What are the tipping points? What actually holds the system together? And then early on, when you basically as a policy planner, and I've spent quite a bit of time in UN policy planning, so I know the problems here. So what are the endpoints of strategic diplomacy you would need to define early on? But again, the endpoints are not within your control. So basically, you would need to forge a coalition of factors that need to be put in place, take a systemic approach to make that happen. So that's basically my pitch for strategic diplomacy and why it is important to employ this kind of approach in today's globalized world.
Thank you. We'll get into more details. Are you using complex theory?
Yeah.
No,
We worked with the Santa Fe people.
Yeah, no wonder why, we are confused. What's, complex theory people make things more complex. So that they're good at confusing us, but therefore we should really tackle that issue a little further. Evelyn?
Yes, we have this reaction quite often. Jochen and I taught strategic diplomacy as a master's course last year as our first attempt at turning this into a teaching session, and then there were many similar questions. Let me try to put a little bit of flesh on the bones of this idea of strategic diplomacy. And indeed, I'm going to talk from an essay which was written by our best student on this course last year. They were given the task of applying the tools of strategic diplomacy to 2 big questions of our time, contemporary questions. One of these questions was, can strategic diplomacy help us to understand how effective the US rebalance has been to Asia so far? And here are some points which I'll offer very briefly to help you get an idea of the strategic diplomacy framework. Now, again, to recap, what we mean by strategic diplomacy is a very intuitive definition. Basically, diplomacy, for those of you who are diplomats or who engage in diplomatic practice in the room, all too often becomes confused with day-to-day nitty-gritty issues of how do you get the next meeting for ambassador with the department of this, that, or the other. By strategic diplomacy, we simply mean diplomacy that is conducted with strategic intent. There's got to be some greater purpose behind it to the service of national interest, to the service of regional order, whatever, some bigger ends to it. So we apply this to the US rebalance to Asia, and we think about the concept as well as the effectiveness of its implementation would begin by asking, what was the rebalance? And when we do that, we hit layer one of our sort of framework, which is, well, okay, what was the strategic narrative behind the rebalance, right? And okay, I'll just leave out all the detail here, but the critical thing about the strategic narrative of the Obama administration's rebalance to Asia was that key issue of a global strategic reprioritization for that administration, one that put Asia as Washington's primary global regional priority, quote unquote, for the first time, right? So that was fairly unprecedented in terms of narrative, okay? This is just rhetorical, but the strategic narrative was that Asia would be the US's primary global regional priority under the rebalance. Second thing that is notable, if you think about strategic narrative, is that other countries in the region, including the really important ones like China, responded to that strategic shift. Now, if you make a rhetorical statement and no one responds, it's useless. But the important thing about this case is that there was significant response in the region to that significant narrative shift. Okay, so that's the sort of rebalance in context. We think about effectiveness of the rebalance from a strategic diplomacy perspective. First question we're going to ask, because strategy is a connection of ends to ways and means. First question we'll ask is, what were the ends? What was the goal, right, of the rebalance? And again, if you go through the material, you can come up with three, I think, fairly uncontestable goals. First goal, reassure US allies and partners in the region about US commitment in the face of regional threats, including China's maritime assertiveness. Goal number one. Goal number two, deter China, encourage its peaceful integration, if possible, into the international order. That has always been US goal. Number three, preserve US preponderance and leadership in the region. Very important one. Again, consistent goal since the end of the Cold War. So there's at least these three goals to the US rebalance, right? I think they're fairly uncontroversial. We can talk about it if you don't think I'm right. Now, then we ask the question, did the Obama administration achieve these three aims using the rebalance policy, right? And if not, why not? If so, great, right? Okay, I don't have a lot of time to go into the details here, but when we do the analysis using a strategic diplomacy lens as opposed to other lenses, what we would emphasize, following on from what Jochen says about using complexity and thinking about the regional order as a system, so we'd emphasize a few things. We'd think about unintended consequences, for one. We'd think about feedbacks, for another. We'd think about non-linear processes, right? And I'll just highlight these three for now. We're accustomed, whether we work in diplomacy or whether we are professors of international relations, we tend to think about A plus B equals C, right? Or put X and Y together and we should get to Z. We're used to linear forms of thinking and policy planning. But if you work in a system, a complex system, linear processes don't work because stuff gets in the way. Things are interconnected, right? So unintended consequences, US rebalance. The intended consequence was to reassure allies. Yes, it did reassure allies. It reassured some allies so much that it emboldened them to take riskier actions than they otherwise would have taken. Right? This is the typical criticism of the Philippines in the South China Sea part of the region, for example. That was an unintended consequence, one that the Americans tried hard to manage in the process of the rebalance. That, in turn, though, clearly prevented the desired outcome of deterring Chinese assertiveness, right? And that in turn obliged the US to take, to compensate by taking even stronger measures than were initially considered under the rebalance policy. For example, freedom of navigation operations were not on the table, right, at the start. So these are sort of loops, in this case, positive feedback loops that lead you to a different sort of equilibrium. In this case, maybe one that is more risky, more dangerous, possibly. So that's unintended consequences and feedback loops. And linearity, again, when we look at this from a strategic diplomacy point of view, we're not asking, we're on step A and step B, what's step C? Right? Because the principle of non-linearity means that China's response, for example, to what is happening under the rebalance will not necessarily be in proportion to what the US or its allies do. This is the principle of nonlinearity. It could be out of proportion to the stimulus. It could take things in a different direction, right? We could be looking at a jump to a much more intense period of strategic competition as a result of the rebalance policy and the initial responses to it. So unfortunately, the world is complex. We may not like it. International relations scholars especially spend a lot of time trying to convince you that the world is really simple. It's not. So that's what we're trying to do with this project and with this framework, to at least equip ourselves with some of the key principles. So how do we deal with complex systems so that we can sort of, bring our analysis a bit further? And my last point simply is regards to that third goal of preserving US preponderance and leadership. If you look at those three goals, the most problematic one is the third one. Because how fundamentally, if the rebalance is framed in terms of maintaining US hegemony in East Asia, right? Then the challenge becomes how on earth to persuade a rising power like China to accept that as the status quo system that it is rising into, right? Which then turns this into a very different game, and one that cannot be managed simply by the rebalance policy the way it has been articulated and put into effect to date. Right? I'll stop there, and there's lots that we can pick up on. Thank you.
Charlie?
Thank you. As this is the last session I have to perform, not only for the Jejuporum, I have to be careful. If I'm relaxed, I might sometimes slip the tongue. But anyway, I will not use a complex theory. I will use a simplicity theory to assess whether South Korean diplomacy is strategic enough. When we talk about whether it's a strategic diplomacy or not, I think first of all we have to see what are the strategic objectives that Korea is trying to pursue, and then the other thing is that whether the outcomes are really kind of effectively serving the objectives by way of by conducting a skillful and efficient skillful diplomacy in the changing Asian new order. So first of all, I wanted to throw out what are the kind of the strategic objectives that South Korea has been pursuing, or especially after the post-Cold War. I think the means of diplomacy have been different, but I think Korea pursued a consistent diplomatic goal over the last 2 decades. First of all, I think foremost and immediate question that Korea is trying to address is a kind of course North Korea question, peninsula question. So how to change the status quo of the Korean peninsula in a way that we make this Korean peninsula denuclearized, unified, peaceful area, even though it might sound very ambitious, but that's the goal that Korea has pursued for a long time. We tried the engagement policy, we tried the very hardline policy, and then now current government is talking about unification, bonanza theory, whatever. So, but still, I think what we were trying to pursue was the kind of change the status quo to the advantage of South Korea, to dismantle the Cold War structure on the Korean peninsula. That's a kind of continuous the goals we have pursued. Also in the region, like the kind of overall theme of the Jejuporum, maintaining peace and prosperity in the region, especially by preventing the emergence of a revisionist state or single predominant power while consolidating cooperative ties among nations on the basis of our alliance relationship with the United States. So that has been I don't think that has not been changed, even though the different administrations tried a different means. The goal was the same. And on the global front, I would say that featuring South Korea as a globally proactive state armed with open trade, universal norms, and then helping developing countries and then spreading democracy and market economy. So it's a kind of a spreading if we follow the kind of previous sessions, the term, using lots of soft power to promote global values shared with other countries, that has been a kind of a consistent goal. So then, having said that, I would say that whether the current government, the Park Geun-hye government, really served this purpose well, especially in the context of a very changing Asia's new order. The challenges we are facing anew is rise of China, and sometimes assertive, and which I call usually, I always call China as a gradual modifier. I don't think China is a status quo country or revisionist country, but try to modify the regional order gradually within the capacity of they can do. And also another challenge is the Japan's quest for a normal country, and that gives a kind of rippling effect in the region. Also, nuclear armed North Korea. So, my overall assessment of the past 3 years of Park Geun-hye government's diplomacy would be, I don't think I can give A. I think the Park Geun-hye government tried lots of risky, perilous choices. If I take a few examples, one, it created a kind of an impression that Korea is tilting toward China too much at the expense of Japan. Of course, I understand the kind of emotional sentiment that the provocative Abe cabinet, the historical, that take a historical revisionism, you cannot have a kind of genuine diplomatic dialogue with Japan, but still, in terms of economy, in terms of dealing with North Korea and other issues, Korea had a too smiling diplomacy with China, as against a kind of a very, well, tough diplomacy with Japan. So, and second, I think the broken dialogue with Japan for a long time, despite continuous U.S. encouragement to do that. So that create a kind of a weak strategic link in a triangular relationship among U.S., Korea, and Japan. And it made it very hard to accomplish our own government set agenda, NEPSI, Northeast Asia, the Peace and Cooperation Initiative. So without having a good relationship with Japan, NEPSI doesn't make any sense. But actually the government has failed to address the issue much more seriously. And then as for the dealing with the North Korea issue, I understand the sentiment, but just the kind of talking about unification bonanza and unification preparation, yes, that's a kind of very, very instructive campaign, domestic campaign for the public, but I don't think that will bring unification, because nobody knows how to bring unification. So that just ruined the kind of another formula that current government set up, that is the Korean Peninsula Trust process. So it's gone, and just what remained is a unification. But nobody knows how that will happen. But it sounds very pessimistic. But I think that the Park Geun-hye government is slightly and then slowly gaining the kind of a balancing momentum, and then trying to try to correct this practice. I have to say that from last fall, the Korea-Japan relationship, both Abe and Park Geun-hye, President Park, took an initiative to normalize the relationship by reaching a consensus on the very thorny issue called the comfort woman issue. So at least the business-to-business relationship has been retrieved. But after that, right after that, we experienced the North Korean nuclear test and missile launch and others that gave a kind of a very twisted perspective about China. I think we come to have a much more realistic sense of China. China will never give up North Korea, and sometimes they only talk about dialogue and negotiation with North Korea, and talking about convening six-party talks, which is not a kind of a effective mechanism to denuclearize North Korea at this moment. So we have a kind of very realistic look at China, rather than having a China fever. Combined is that the kind of entering this year, many businessmen come to realize that the Korea-China business relationship is getting more and more competitive rather than complementary, especially in a major industrial sector like shipbuilding, and then electronics, and the steel and others, petrochemicals. So then we cannot remain just complacent about the kind of rapidly catching up China. So I think we still have to develop a very good relationship with China, I think, but still people come to have a much more realistic evaluation of how to proceed with the relationship with China. And finally, because of the North Korean provocations, united stance toward the North Korean issue came to be possible. I'm not necessarily a great fan of putting sanction and pressure on North Korea, but I think it's time to put pressure on North Korea for some period of time. Ultimately, Korean question should be solved by negotiated solution through negotiation. But at the moment, I think we have to give a penalty to North Korean provocative behavior and bad behaviors, and then let them realize that this is not the thing that can run in the international society. So I think we are trying to keep balance, but still whether this will move on very smoothly, I don't know, especially in the context of the change in the domestic political context, and then much more weakening Korean economy in the global recession. So I think we have to be very skillful and then really having a better tactics to navigate through a very turbulent world. I'll stop there.
Professor Huang Jing.
Thank you for inviting me here. When Johan and Evelyn asked me to talk about strategic diplomacy, frankly, I like the idea as they defined, because diplomacy is not driven by issue. Diplomacy is a kind of policy driven by your overall understanding of grand momentum of today's world, and also it is driven by your strategic goal, as Evelyn just defined. In that regard, I just accomplished research together with some of my Chinese colleagues about what China is going to do in the years to come, and that was tailored by the new leadership, the Chinese leadership about this. I share some of my points here. And, in today's, because we know that strategic diplomacy is first and foremost depend on or determined by your view, the global view or world view of what's going on. So today's Chinese leaders see it's prepared by my research assistant, very fancy. So I try to let me put all of them out so that before I can start. And Chinese leader view of global trends are two. Number one is so-called international or economic integration, which means that in the world of moving to the second is that the second trend is that we're moving from unipolar world to the multipolar world. And sorry, I still try to let me forget this. The first trend about economic integration, and the second trend is we are moving into multipolar world. And on those two trends, on the first one, international economic integration, United States and China do have some common interests. Convergence is more than divergence. Both countries are competing for the leadership of this trend. That is who and how the rule is going to be made. If you look at TPP or RCEP or One Belt, One Road promoted by both countries, they're basically doing the same thing. They bring us into each other economically, not separate us from each other. And again, and both leaderships, especially Chinese leadership, realized economic integration was created or was developed not by any government policies, but by market forces, by capitalism, and it's defined by the global value chain. It is on this how we are going to look at this trend towards a multipolar strategic situation that China and United States do have a much conflicting interests. And this is China's view. Based on this kind of view, let me talk about China's so-called strategic diplomacy. Again, let me put all this out together. And China is trying to promote infrastructure-led development mode. If you look at China's all of those things, One Belt, One Road, AIB, FTAP, BRICS banks, and very soon, I believe, after Putin caved in, maybe we're going to see that China is going to propose a Shanghai Organization Bank. All of this, of course, is trying to strengthen, number one, China's position in the global financial order, number two, to strengthen China's position in the global trading system, and number three, of course, to reinforce China as orbit of economic development in Asian Pacific and beyond. But for the United States, of course, United States is trying to maintain the US dollar's credibility and hegemony, and of course TPP, TTIP. So the key point is that United States and China are compete for the dominance in rulemaking, especially in the global finance and economic integration. But having said that, they don't have a fundamental difference. They only have a competition or rivalry or competition. But on the next move, so for the Chinese, the Xi Jinping leadership realized that in order to engage Americans and optimize China's strengths, to promote integration and promote multipolar world, serve China's interests. And how they do that? I think that first, let me go very quickly about that. People always think that China's development model is driven by investment. That is a little bit misleading. Actually, China's development model is driven by what we call infrastructure-led. If you look at all those years, the number of growth of either highway or high-speed railroad or growth of electronic power or the aviation cargoes and passengers or the growth of foreign reserves or external investment, it's all more than 10% or 20%. If based on that, a 9% average GDP growth, it just reflects this kind of infrastructure-led. And China's One Belt, One Road is trying to export this kind of road, and China has certain capability to promote this. But why China want to promote this? This is my next point. So again, the growth rate of all the major infrastructure indicators are higher or much higher than the average of GDP growth in the past 20 years. But why China want to do this? So there are three dimensions in China's so-called strategic diplomacy. The first, of course, I don't want to dwindle too much about it, is the so-called new type of relationship between major countries, not major power. In China's term, major countries means country big and small are equal, but major power has great power, middle power, small power. That's not equal. And in this kind of relationship, two quick points. What China really wants from the United States is equal footing in global agenda setting and rulemaking. Not equal power, because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as a hegemon, the United States that environmental issue is a global issue. We all go for it. And the United States said that energy security is a global issue. We all go for it. And China said, no. This time, let's talk about we jointly set up global agenda. If you look at all those summits between President Xi Jinping and Obama in the past few years, that's what Xi Jinping wants. Equal footing, not in terms of power, but in terms of global agenda setting. And of course, they also want to institutionalize the bilateral relationship between the United States and China so that they can maximize or optimize common interests and minimize the danger of conflict of interest to manage. Actually, this institutionalized the relationship, bilateral relationship, is somehow stolen from Jim Steinberg's strategic reassurance, which was put forward in 2009, but China dropped the ball because of leadership transition. And they really like Jim Steinberg's idea for whatever reason. But of course, when Jim published his book, he put resolve. He added resolve there, which is a little bit a correction. And second dimension, of course, is to use simple language, economy takes command, is the development of community of common destiny, 共同命运体. Why they do that? Because China knows that if have a confrontation match with the United States is much stronger in terms of capability, in terms of strength, in terms of soft power. United States is way above China. But what China trying to do, if you read Xi Jinping's recent speeches, he wants to first to so-called promote joint economic development, to develop the so-called same boat common interests. If you look at One Belt, One Road, AIB, and etc., it's all for this purpose. Why they do that? Because China try to establish a collective security mechanism based on common interests. That is, if economically we're all in the same boat, then therefore can work up a so-called collective security mechanism. And then the third one is a global strategic partnership network, which is trying to promote it. But here we're going to say, what's the difference? And China's propaganda or China's advocacy trying to promote a kind of fundamental difference between China's strategic partnership and the U.S. allies. Because there are people who always say that, where are Chinese allies? Chinese don't have friends, they don't have allies, they're alone. But here Chinese said, no, not like this. U.S. alliance system is ideological driven, military confrontational, and as a result, organizationally exclusive, not inclusive, and in terms of positions, not equal, because the United States always take a dominant role in the alliance system, either U.S.-Japan or U.S.-ROC or U.S.-COST. But China, this is what China says, but doesn't mean it practice. What China says that China's global strategic partnership network is driven by interests, not by values, not by ideology. The best example, of course, is the AIIB. The best, strongest American allies, except Japan, all rush into AIIB, driven by their interests. And therefore, it is for cooperation, not for confrontation. And as a result, it's inclusive. Door is open. The more, the better. And China said, equal footing. We're all equal in this. So in that way, China trying to gain the moral high ground in its engagement with Americans. Successful or not, we don't know. But that's what the so-called 3D, the China tried to highlight. Let me finish. Last one is that, and the result. Also, we can see that despite all those argument or computation rivalry between United States and China, the fact is that the U.S.-China, at least in terms of economic exchange, keep going. And this is United States, this is China, you can see the export exchange. But what really amazing is what the U.S. trade with Asian Pacific continue to double, but China's trade with region increased by 7 times. That's the result. If you look into more specific, it's even more alarming. China's trade with ASEAN from 2014, this is China, this is United States. Again, if we look at numbers, the US trade with ASEAN increased about 0.6 times, while China's trade with ASEAN increased 11.2 times in this 15 years. And if you look at US-China trade, of course, the total trade volume increased by 6.5 times, and in 2014, China's export to the United States was 2.5 times bigger than import from the United States, and the trend continues. And last but not the least is the trade partners. We know that about 10 years ago, about 8 countries in Asian Pacific, of which United States is the largest trading partner. Nowadays, only 2. Which 2 do you know? China and Cambodia. But now 15 countries in Asian Pacific region, of which China is the largest trade partners and going, and the momentum is going. I agree with you, China come. So, and you say United States number one trading partner, China and Cambodia, Japan, Brunei, and the Philippines, India, Bhutan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and China has 15, now 14, 15 actually, including all the major allies of the United States. I think that's why China sees the economic integration as a foundation for China's strategic diplomacy, because that way China can optimize its strengths, get more leverages vis-a-vis the United States, and also have more people around China and get them into Chinese orbit. And this is a map. But there is a fundamental problem. That's my conclusion. The fundamental problem is that China's political system is not compatible with the political mainstream of the international community. You try to do business with the international community, you try to do business with all those members, but your political system is not the same with the mainstream. That's a fundamental source or essential source of China's problem with the outside world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just have about 10-minute discussion with panelists, and I will open it to the floor. Johan, how do you see, the Park Chung-hee and Huang Jing gave their own interpretation of strategic diplomacy of South Korea and China. Does your analytical frame fit in or not fit in? In what sense? And also, along with that, would you clarify your concept more in simpler terms? But the way you described it was very complex, like complex theory.
Yes. What comes out, particularly in Tsing's presentation, is, look, my starting point was we talk so much about multipolarity, return of geopolitics, end of hegemony. So basically, there's no master idea anymore that would actually be able to get the pull-in, the buy-in from the others in the world. There's no liberal momentum that would basically allow us, yes, just follow the United States and we will live in a better world. They are competing, contesting concepts, and that basically, that came out in Tsing's presentation particularly well. We have a US vision or a remaining vision of the liberal world, which is now competing with a more Chinese understanding of how the world should be organized. And all these initiatives, like the One Road, One Belt initiative, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, BRICS Development Bank, are testimony, are examples of that. And particularly interesting is China's more systemic approach, how they try to shape the system in order basically then to make a difference. Well, but very important here is the strategic narrative. And that basically brings us, well, how can we actually explain that in more simple terms? And that's exactly the struggle of today. We are all confronted with very complex problems, but we need to explain those complex problems to an audience that will not necessarily understand all the complexities of the minutiae of the problems involved. So you need to find a narrative that actually creates a buy-in. We need to do this. This is the narrative I derive from all the complexities from my analysis, but there needs to be a narrative that creates not only the international buy-in, but also the domestic buy-in to actually take a particular course of action. And that's basically a struggle.
Then here, Johan, what is your dependent variable? But the way you described your theory, there's nothing but process, not outcomes. You were just trying to explain the process dynamics linking end to means when you describe it.
No, you would start with a systems approach towards...
It's a very much general systems approach.
You would start with a systems approach to explain the problem and then try to situate the problem within a larger systemic context and then look at the entry points, which are the most relevant and efficient entry points to address the problem in a more effective way.
So how do you identify those entry points and the tipping points?
Yes. You can do that. I will do that tomorrow with a specific reference to German unification, which will have serious repercussions for an understanding of potential Korean unification, because German unification, for example, happened with a clear understanding of the system. German unification could not have happened without a systems approach towards diplomacy, because it was not just involving two states, East and West Germany. It happened within the larger European security system as a whole. And policy analysts and policy planners understand that very well, and it can be basically then, you can rewrite German unification along those lines really well. So, and what Tsing did in his presentation, I think, very effectively to bring out the tensions and also the challenges in basically of clashing strategic narratives that then are currently in the arena, which now is struggling for mastery, which narrative will actually become the master narrative. And as it stands, this is now an open-ended process.
Okay, Evelyn, if you look at those data presented by the Huang Jing, all this American people to Asia or American effort to maintain hegemony would not work. If the American hegemony is already gone, if you look at all those statistical data, then how do you, defend your position with regard to the American people to Asia?
I'm not an apologist for U.S. rebellions to Asia, let's put it there. I'm just a scholar looking at the material. But I'm sure you do this too, Professor Moon. One of the first things I always say to my students when I do methods teaching is that you can do anything with figures, right? You can show stuff, and what's more important is what's not shown. So if we look at some of those figures, it is true that China's share of trade in the region, for example, has massively gone up. And the figures are astounding, as Professor Huang has said. But Professor Huang also well knows that the rise in trade of, say, ASEAN and China is component trading, right? It's the regional production network. Vietnam produces parts of computers, so does Malaysia, Indonesia. These different parts get assembled in China. China is the final export point. Where's the export market? United States.
The US and Europe.
The United States, European Union, Japan. These are still East Asia's main export markets. It's not an either or. I said this in the last panel. We don't live in a world of either or anymore. East Asia now, as a whole, depends as much upon these external markets that we have always depended on as we do now on China, which is now the new assembly point for a lot of the manufactured products that as a region we produce. So, these figures only show one part of it, but it doesn't mean that the United States has stopped being important to the economies of Asia, because who's going to buy your stuff at the end of the day?
No, then
right?
With whose money? America is a deficit country. Without the Chinese so-called investment in national treasury bond.
Absolutely, but that's beautiful, isn't it? This is the new mutual assured destruction, which is what we call it. This is a new MAD. Because China and the US are in this situation where the US standard of living, US democracy indeed, depends upon Chinese ability to keep financing US debt. Right. So
Professor Huang Jing, how would you respond to the Evelyn's argument? Evelyn is saying that still the age of American hegemony.
No.
Saying that, are you still the age? Yeah, I'm not. I'm saying that China is rising in a world in which the U.S. is still important.
But I would beg to disagree a little bit with Evelyn about the trade volume. Today's trade is no longer defined by how many cars I buy from you, how many pants you buy from me. It's not also depend which part produce which countries. Today's trade is more defined by the global value chain. Global value chain is such that is three elements. Number one, how big the employment is generated. Number two is value chain, how much cash you can mobilize in your overtrade. For example, China is the largest trade nation. And number three is that how can you strengthen yourself to resist the crisis. And there is a new argument surfaced that, for example, China is the largest trading nation. Therefore, some people argue China should be more powerful and richer than the United States from the perspective, like the family. Your family can own a house is $10 million. My family only own a house for $1 million. But my weekly spending can be $1 million. Your weekly spending is only $500,000. Then I should be more powerful because we have more cash flow. That's where China's strength is. As number one nation, trading nation, China have more cash flow in terms. That's how you define the trading. That is your strength. And second, about American hegemon. Hegemon is defined by your overall capability. This overall capability include, number one, of course, your hard power. Number two, who align its policy with your policy. For example, although China, there are 15 countries of which China is the number one trading partner, but none of them align the national policy with China's policy, even though they do trade. Korea, Japan, Australia, just name three. China is the largest trading partner, but all the foreign policies align with the United States, not with China. This goes to number three, of course, soft power. In that regard, America is still very strong than China. In that regard, United States it still is. I'll go a little further, Evelyn, still is a hegemon in the region. It is exactly because that China tried to bypass this American hegemon. That's why they promote the so-called joint development integration to optimize China's strengths. Because a head-to-head confrontation with the United States, China has been far, far away from that point yet.
Therefore, then you are implying that China is pursuing circumventive hegemonic strategy. Don't confront the existing hegemony, but just circumvent it.
That is, another thing about strategic diplomacy. China has a long tradition of doing that. And thousands of years ago, all Chinese thinkers like Confucius, Xunzi, or Sunzi, also your policy should be made upon your view, your vision of what is going on in the world, not by the issue, not issue-driven. So just now you asked me to translate middle power into Chinese. I scratch my head, there's no such translation of middle power in Chinese. But strategic diplomacy, there's a perfect translation right there called 战略外交, not 战术外交.
That's a literal translation, 战略外交.
战略外交. Yeah, it has been used for thousands of years in China. And of course, you go to any Chinese scholars in the II, you ask him, what is 战略外交? Without thinking, he or she will say, strategic diplomacy.
Okay, Charlie, you come up with very interesting, overview of a Park Geun-hye policy. And you're right, I agree with you. President Park Geun-hye, used to, she come up with a very three beautifully, sought out in the strategic, diplomacy concept. First one was the Korean Peninsula Trust process. Second one was balanced diplomacy. Third one is Northeast Asian peace and, development peace and cooperation initiative. They're really the beautiful one. In other words, the first one is strategic diplomacy vis-a-vis North Korea. Second, component was strategic diplomacy vis-a-vis the United States and China. And third one is really effort toward the multilateral cooperation initiative. But now, President Park Geun-hye's term is less than 1.5 years, okay? And now, Korean Peninsula Trust process has become non-trust and confrontational process, okay? Or balanced diplomacy now is tilting toward the United States, creating new tension with China. And peace and cooperation, Northeast Asian Peace and Cooperation Initiative has become non-peace and non-cooperation initiative. Is it what, strategic adjustment, or President Park Geun-hye doesn't have any concept at all? What is your take on that?
Do you want me to put in the prison or indicted in the...
No, Korea is a democratic country, therefore you can speak. Okay.
But I think in the beginning, when the conception was produced, I think they have a good intention and goodwill, and then has some kind of a strategy, modest, relatively modest. Like I liked more like a kind of Korean Peninsula trust process much more than unification bonanza, because
that is not strategy. I remember presidential committee. Therefore.
So even though I asked the foreign ministry and unification ministry, they don't know where it comes from. So like that is I don't know whether it's a kind of a genuine strategy to implement it, because if you do not have the policy tools make it happen, you can hardly call it a strategy. So then unification can be a long-term goal of South Korea. Of course, we should unify the country, but the talking about the unification bonanza does not bring about unification at all. In that sense, it's not strategic. And then NAPSI is like a kind of a donut. You're talking about cooperation with other countries, but essence, in the Northeast Asia, kind of Japan and China, if you cannot facilitate the cooperation among the three countries, NAPSI doesn't make any sense. It's a kind of just a kind of spreading your budget and then go to the seminar and explain it. I wanted to save our tax money rather than doing that. I wanted to invent much more strategic diplomacy if time is given. So I don't want to be that much strategic.
Let us put it this way.
Yeah.
Does the President Park Geun-hye government have strategic diplomacy? Or such a strategic mind?
I will come back to the complexity theory then.
Maybe Evelyn, what did you take then? Does President Park Geun-hye have strategic diplomacy in your conceptualization?
I just wanted to mention a few things. One, there is no kind of a clear kind of a control center for strategic diplomacy at the moment. Nobody knows who is leading. That's the problem. Second, there is no serious debate within the kind of Blue House or the foreign ministry or whatever. They just follow the dictation from somewhere else. So there is no debate. And there is no public diplomacy toward the public. They just kind of repeat the same language, but people do not understand what that means. So it's a kind of a...
Evelyn, if that is to be the case, then how would you judge or assess President Park Geun-hye's strategic diplomacy?
I'm not a Korea expert, so I'm probably not the best place to do this. But I may add that from what you're saying, from what I understand, I think it is this case of the Park Geun-hye administration's strategic diplomacy or not really highlights two things that we'd like to highlight with the framework. One is the importance of process, which comes back to the question you were asking, Jochen. Things like decision making, where's the center, what are the channels, what are the processes, is critical in dealing with complex systems. And Korea is in a situation quite unique to Asia, where there are so many different audiences that a South Korean administration, which are primary to a South Korean administration, not the same as other countries, right? Your domestic audience and the different factions of it, which, as you indicated, not well handled, your North Korean audience, your American ally audience, your Chinese partner audience, and then the rest, right? But these are only the most important ones. And that's already four. Strategic audiences. How do you tailor a strategic narrative if you don't know who you're talking to primarily, or you don't decide who you're talking to
Professor
primarily?
Huang, how would you compare with China, and how would you compare China with South Korea? But apparently, given your presentation, China has a very strategic diplomacy and strategic mind.
Because of China's single-party rule, usually when China decide or determine its strategy, it's a little bit easier. China's problem is in the implementation because there are so many provinces. And Korea is a diplomatic society, and they have a strong opposition all the time. So therefore, it is very difficult to have two parties say eye to eye on a strategic issue, on the vision of the world. For example, how to deal with North Korea, how to deal with China, how to deal with the United States. All those of major strategic issues reflect Koreans' view, a vision of our world. And if you have a fundamental difference on this, therefore the strategic diplomacy is still with there. So I think that's the fact. But on the other hand, once Koreans are diplomatic, as democratic society, just like the United States, once a decision is made, a strategy is made, the implementation could be very consistent. That's where the strength of democracy is.
Thank you very much for your very complimentary remarks on our government. Okay, I will open to the floor. Okay, Tae-Hwan Kim, who else? I will take up a couple of questions and comments from the floor. No one? Okay, and Professor Sonyal? Okay, we'll go for the first two comments. Okay.
Okay, I got a question to Jo Chen and Evelyn.
How do you pronounce it? Jo Chen or
Jo Chen,
Johan?
What is it?
Johan.
Johan,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Johan and Evelyn.
Zhou Chen is very weird.
Well, I was,
now, Johan was better.
You're so mean. Well, I should say that I was so much fascinated when I first encountered the notion strategic diplomacy. But frankly, I am now at the moment more confused than convinced with the notion. Particularly one thing, when you say strategic diplomacy, I think you definitely have to clarify the dimensional problem. When we think about the foreign policy of a particular country, at least we have two different dimensions, or realms, or field, if you like. So security field, you have security policy. The economic field, you have economic policy, foreign policy. Cultural field, the list may go on and on. But is that possible then, just for the purpose of clarification, is it possible for a country to have multiple strategic diplomacies in different dimensions? Or when you say to qualify, to fit with your notion of strategic diplomacy, there must be some a grand strategy that incorporate actually all the policies and programs in different sectors, different dimensions that I just mentioned. When we talking about, say, for example, war on terror, is it a strategic diplomacy, or is it simply a foreign policy in the field of national security of the United States, but there must be some grand foreign policy strategy that possibly could incorporate war on terror? What is it?
Professor Sonyal, I think that Johan, you got the answer to the Professor Kim Tae-hwan's, question.
When you say diplomacy and strategic diplomacy, I'm still sort of confused. What is the value added when you put strategic into diplomacy? If that is a real, the useful concept for that. That's number one. And number two, how do you measure this is strategic and non-strategic? What I'm saying is that middle power. We discussed that whether that's an aspirational concept or not. Then, how do you say that? What you just mentioned that you have the strategic goals. That's fine. Is it part of? That should be the part of strategic diplomacy. But strategic diplomacy should be more than that, right? Goals plus something else. Then how do you sort of conceptualize those parts?
Evelyn, you can answer to Professor Son's questions. Okay, you can make a division of labor between husband and wife.
Well, the questions are obviously related, and in a nutshell, if you want to hear a CNN soundbite, the difference between diplomacy and strategic diplomacy is diplomacy with systems implications. Global finance, for example, you can tinker a lot about processes, go down to technocratic problems that need to be addressed. But strategic diplomacy would think in system terms that will address the problems of global finance within the larger context of a system. And that's quite important. So rather than having an idea of state interests, you would think in terms of systems interests if you pursue diplomacy through that area. It's important in some areas, it's more important than others. We can agree on that. So,
War on terror is a strategic?
Yeah, but war on terror is more a strategic narrative that would and under that major narrative, various policies can be subsumed. So war on narrative, and also, well, if you want middle power diplomacy, for me, that would be more a strategic narrative. How you position yourself or your country in a wider context, how do you actually exercise influence in a world that is deeply contested, in which you really have to justify your strategy in order to win, in order to make it the master strategy, in order to exercise influence over the solution of a particular problem. And I think that's very important here.
Evelyn?
This is my second back-to-back panel. Can you remind me what the question was again?
Strategic diplomacy
versus diplomacy. Again, because it's connected, I actually wanted to use the global war on terror as an example. That is your classic complex system problem, right? Because we're so used to thinking about global war on terror, but that's because of the success of that, strategic narrative label that one particular hegemon put on it. And the hegemonic force of that strategic narrative, I think we're all familiar with. If you think about who actually signed on to the global war on terror and what certain countries and leaders did with that label, under the label of the global war on terror, many, many things were put, right? There were many domestic suppressions that were carried out under that label. Many other types of arms transfers, etc., justified under the terrorism labels. That's the power of a strategic narrative that serves the purposes not just of your enterprise, but where you can find convergence, where it can be instrumentally employed by other states, actors as well. Now, but the global war on terror, or terrorism, as we know it now, is not a single issue area, it's not a single realm. It's both economic and security, for example. Right? Do you know where the biggest realm of the fight in the global and ongoing global war on terrorism is today? Any guesses? Which realm it's in? It's not in, boots on the ground, people fighting in jungles. It's in financial realms. It's that challenge of how do you crack down on terrorist financing, right? And this goes through many complex webs. Of half-back channel type things, Islamic finance to some degree, but other sorts, right, of offshoring of finance and things like that as well. That's the hard front of the war against terror today. So that's an ideal example of how one cannot separate out economic realm, security realm neatly into these boxes, And so strategic diplomacy gets at this idea of, often our governments and our government agencies are separated according to these realms and issues. But, these contemporary problems cannot be tackled just by one government department acting by itself. There's got to be a lot more of these connections, and that's a first step domestically to dealing with complex issues, which, none of our governments anywhere really do very well at the moment.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah, it's really, this is Hyung Tae Kong at East Asia Foundation. When I first heard the strategic diplomacy, I thought it's state actors' perspective. I thought that way, isn't it? Still, it's the main actor, the state actor, right? So when you say strategy means as a state actor, you do certain diplomatic actions, including military actions, with whole picture. Just Johan mentioned the system perspective, right? Isn't it? We consider all kinds of environment, whole big pictures, then narrow down our interest, then make plus minus decisions. Isn't it already strategic enough? I thought that way, but the way you present is sometimes confusing. It's just describing the process. Even Professor Moon mentioned about what's your dependence variable. Is there dependence variable there? No.
In the complex theory, there is no dependent variable.
It's just kind of you repeatedly use the term strategic narrative. It sounds like some. Of course, that's one part of the theory, right? Yeah.
Maybe, we'll be having a workshop on strategic diplomacy
So
tomorrow
I'm
at the Habitat Hotel, but we'll further
keep
discuss that one.
clearing my-
But I have one
clarifying
question
myself.
to, Park Cha-hee.
Trying to follow up. Yeah.
President Park Geun-hye, okay, she has a kind of a selective affinity vis-à-vis Japan. If we all expected that she would have a very good diplomatic relationship with Japan, and Abe's maternal grandfather and Park Geun-hye's father were very close, okay, and they would play the important role in normalizing diplomatic ties between Japan and South Korea. But why Park Geun-hye was so capitalizing on comfort woman issue? And why December last year, I understand that you were part of that conspiracy, all of a sudden, President Park Geun-hye made a concession on comfort woman issue for the sake of strategic interest called dealing with North Korea. How can we understand that one? Because everybody thought that for the sake of strategic interest, Park Geun-hye would work with Japan despite history issues. But she didn't do that. Yet, last December, all of a sudden, she virtually pardoned Abe. Okay, we now work strategically. Which one is strategic?
Well, I don't want to put the strategic there. The having Park Chung-hee as her father is the burden, strategic burden for her, strategic asset for her. So I think she was quite extremely careful in conducting a diplomacy toward Japan, and she was a female. We all forget that she was a female. She's a female, the president who take care of the female, the feminist issue and the comfort woman issue much more seriously than any other people. And then Abe was extremely provocative when she was elected president. The Abe in 2012 and Abe in 2015 is quite different. He toned down historical controversy a lot, strategically, for the sake of Japan's interest. But so I think if you analyze the President Park's rhetoric and the Abe's rhetoric, it goes side by side. Abe tones down, Park Geun-hye tones down. Abe tones down, Park Geun-hye tones down. That's the reason why they could agree on the comfort woman issue. So it's a kind of I don't think there is a secret of the kind of confidential diplomacy that solves everything, but it's a kind of they mutually try to find the kind of some agreeable points at the last moment, but knowing that this cannot completely resolve everything, but at least the reviving the business-to-business relationship is critically important in the changing historical development. I just add up one thing, because I remained too much critical to Park Geun-hye government, but still we shouldn't forget that Korea has kind of a very good assets that we can develop further there, because we have flexible dynamism in our country. So kind of Japanese always say that the Koreans are always thinking while running. They always think, and then after that they began running. But they're running and thinking at the same time. And then we have a superb internationalized human resources, well educated, and then pretty much modest, diverse experience that can be globalized in anywhere in the world. Cultural soft assets are really pretty much mature. So most of all, we have an aspiration to do better than any other country.
I understand. Okay,
Yeah.
now I always understand your pro-government position. Professor
Not
Huang,
pro-government,
let me
pro-Korea.
ask one final question to you. Okay, now a lot of experts forecasted China may not be able to achieve 6% per annum growth rate, and also I have been listening all kinds of complaints from the academicians and others about party disciplinary committees involvement. Now they are no longer allowing overseas trips, giving lectures and whatever. In other words, the leftists are taking power within the Communist Party system. And China seems to be increasingly rigid. Okay? On that kind of setting, what kinds of strategic diplomacy can you expect from China?
That's a tough question. I don't have a simple answer for that. The first question, I do not believe that's realistic that China can still remain anything above 6% growth, because the driver of the economy is from demand side shift to supply side. Just like what happened to Korea 10 years ago, or what happened to Japan 20 years ago. So if China can maintain about five would be lucky. On the anti-corruption campaign, I think essentially it's an anti-monopoly struggle. I just done a research, compare China today and the United States at the late 19th centuries. After Civil War, United States also has a very fast development driven by the demand side, not by supply side. So it takes 3 presidents 30 years to get rid of monopoly, from the 1819 Sherman Act also to 1914 Antitrust Act. And China is also the same thing, because when you try to shift the driver from demand side to supply side, you have to redistribute resources, redistribute how you spend your money. That's a struggle, life and death struggle. So on the other side, those who monopolize resources during 30 years or 40 years fast development will not give up. So use Bill Clinton's word, it's economy stupid. So it is Xi Jinping has no choice. In order to push economy forward, he will have to recollect all the resources and redistribute them. In the process, he set himself in a confrontation with so-called privileged interest groups. So it's a long-term fight.
No, Professor Huang, it is more than just anti-monopoly and anti-oligopoly in a policy, because now it is being said that the Chinese Communist Party is now intervening in such a way to discipline individual behavior and their words and remarks. Therefore, you're going back to all the Cultural Revolution
Time
period.
is up. We can talk about them, but basically, Xi Jinping, Chairman Mao Zedong, and Deng Xiaoping did the same thing. That is, when they try to force a deep and massive reform, they hit institutional wall. They cannot bypass it. That's why they try to mobilize forces outside the system to do sense. But Mao made a mistake, mobilized the forces, but did not control them. That's why he had 10 years Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping learned a good lesson. So when Deng Xiaoping tried to mobilize the forces to do away with Hua Guofeng, he immediately set up the 4 cardinal principles. Xi Jinping is even smarter. Left hand, he tried to mobilize the forces from society under the corrupted so-called cadres to push through institutional war. But right hand, he began to control it. But his opponent tried to set him up. He said, let's move 1 inch to the left. His opponent will move 10 yards from left to make all the troubles on him. So it's very complicated. Like I said, it's complex.
Okay, let us give a big applaud.